All right, Parsha 101, Parshas Vayikra, starting a new book of the Torah. This is book number 3, and it's Vayikra, or if you want to call it Leviticus, if you know what that means, or we'll just stick with Vayikra. So Vayikra is also the name of the first Torah portion in the third book of the Torah. It's Vayikra el Moshe v'yidaber Hashem elav. That a God called to Moshe, and he spoke with him by the tent of the meeting, saying, Kol Oamoy, that's what they mean when they refer to the actual sanctuary of the tabernacle of the Mishkan, versus like the wider tabernacle compound, that also had the whole courtyard that had the altar in it, etc. Now, kind of as a little brief intro to the book of Vayikra, this whole book now is going to have a lot of technical stuff in it. A lot of the laws, this one starts with a lot of the sacrifices, and not a lot of story going on here. Obviously, there's a lot of commentary on all this about what's going on and what the whole deal with sacrifices and why and all that kind of stuff. Just as a simple way to kind of look at it, or just one of the basic 101 ways, as we are, to look at it is that you have Parshas Vayikra talks about why there was a need for a chosen people. God created the world, and everyone was in the world, and everything should have been perfect, and everything quickly went all crazy. Until finally a family had to be saved, and from that family we had the one that's designated now to spread the light of God, to spread the word of God, because people are worshiping adultery, they're not treating each other right. Generalized, but this is what occurs. Book of Shmos now talks about how that chosen family is now going to become a holy people, right? So it's all about the Exodus and getting the Torah and building the Mishkan, etc. Now we come to the third book of the Torah, and it's like, well, this is what the whole buildup is all about. These are the laws of the Torah that are for them to keep. And another thing about this is that we use the word, there's a lot about sacrifices in this Torah portion, so kind of technical stuff. We'll still walk through it just to give an understanding of what went on. And the word Korban, it's the Hebrew word that we use for sacrifice, but that's not its actual literal translation. It's kind of like what happens with the word teshuva. People translate as repentance, but that's not the literal translation of that either. Teshuva means to reconnect, right? To return. So Korban, even though we use it as sacrifice, it doesn't really mean sacrifice. It actually comes from the root word of karov, to come close. Because this is what's really occurring through a sacrifice, through burning up the animal, or whatever the sacrifice is going to be. It's kind of symbolic of detaching ourselves, or slaughtering, or giving up a piece of our animal selves that keeps us separated from God, right? So this is a method now of coming closer to God. And all of the sacrifices that were brought were either voluntarily to come, I want to draw close to God now, or because I have to repent and got to rectify for something that I've done, which also draws me close to God. Okay, now something interesting also about Parshas Vayikra, if you look in the Torah, you'll see the aleph, Vayikra is spelled as an aleph at the end of the word, and it's a small aleph. Obviously, again, a lot of commentary on it, and one of the predominant ones that this represents the humility that Moshe had. Vayikra el Moshe, that God's calling it to Moshe, and this small aleph represents the humility. That part of what Moshe's humility was, it wasn't just recognizing the virtue of other people, but he didn't see himself as such a great person. He knew he was a leader of the people, he knew what he had done, but he believed that all of his success and everything that he had accomplished was only because God had given him the capacities to do so, and he was just realizing the capacities he was given, right? To him, someone else could have been given great capacities, and they would have been even greater than him. But, I don't know how you become greater than Moses when Moses is it. It's actually interesting that they say that when you look at the creation of Adam, the creation of the first man, there's a larger aleph there. Adam is spelled with an aleph, the first letter. It's a little bit of a larger aleph because Adam was kind of like the epitome of God's creation, right? This is the man. This is, the perfect man to have been created. So, say just on a personal level, we could kind of say that sometimes people are going about life, like, who am I? What have I done? What am I doing here? All this kind of, etc. And part of it you got to remember the large aleph. Like, you were formed by God's own hand. He put you here with purpose and with reason. And that's, a little bit of aleph. But at the same time, we have to temper it, though, with humility. We have to temper it with the small aleph. So that the large aleph to remind us about what we're doing here, and the small aleph to remind us to not let that get too much to our head, to actually become arrogant in that. Okay, so now let's go to the Parsha. So in this week's Parsha, it talks a lot about the sacrifices. And what would happen is that when Hashem would call out to Moshe, because last week we ended off with the tabernacle, the cloud descended and then Moshe couldn't go in. So as in he couldn't enter into the Holy of Holies, he couldn't enter into there while the cloud was there. So there'd be certain times that God would kind of temper it a little bit, and then he would call out to Moshe, and Moshe would audibly and internally sense God calling out to him, and then he would enter into the sanctuary, but he would not go into the Holy of Holies. Hashem's voice would emanate from between the cherubim, the cherubs on the ark, right, the two kind of angel, childlike creatures on the ark. That's where his voice would emanate from. Then Moshe would be standing behind the curtain, or before the curtain, kind of facing there, and that's where he would hear what God would transmit to him. And a lot of it are the laws and everything to follow. So now these are the sacrifices that are detailed, that are spoken about here. In general, there's 4 different kinds of sacrifices. You could have what's called an ascent, an olah, a peace, a shlamim, sin, chatas, or a guilt, the asham. So we had 4 different kinds of sacrifices, and we're going to cover a lot of them here. There are some that were offered by the individual. There's some that were communal. There were some that were voluntary. There were some that were obligatory. There were some that were animal. There were some that were vegetable, mineral, a lot of different things going on. So the first carbon that's spoken about is the carbon olah. They call it a scent offering. Okay, and this was to atone for an intentional neglect of a positive commandment that it was now past time to perform. So, for example, let's say someone missed their chance at saying Shema or something like that. So they had to, oh my goodness, I realized it, whatever. So they wanted to atone for it, or to atone for an intentional neglect of an active commandment that's supposed to compensate for a prohibitive commandment. Sometimes people call it a passive commandment because it's a thou shalt not do, as in abstain from doing this action. So that's why they refer to it as a passive commandment. So sometimes there's something you're supposed to do to kind of, oh, you didn't do that, so here, do this now to make up for it. And then if they totally didn't do any of that, then there has to be a sacrifice that's brought. And this is a sacrifice that could be brought kind of in partnership with someone else, and it would be a domestic animal from a cattle or the flock. It can't be an animal. The animal has to be a perfect animal. It can't be a stolen animal, someone committed bestiality with it. It can be used. It couldn't be one that was ever used for idolatry or designated for idolatry. It couldn't have ever fatally gored anyone else, and it couldn't be suffering from any fatal disease. But as you can imagine, just for all sacrifices, these animals are very carefully inspected. It also has a general thing is that once an animal was designated a sacrifice, you couldn't just magically switch it out. That now became holy, and that was different now. And there were a lot of there were laws that were around that when an animal's been designated for a sacrifice. So now, if in this carbon olah, this ascent offering, the person decides that they're going to offer cattle, so it has to be an unblemished male, specifically here a male, and what they would do is this whole process. And we'll go through here, but it's kind of like ditto for a lot of the sacrifices to follow. They had to bring it to the entrance of the Ol Moed, right? They couldn't go in. Only a priest, only the Kohen was allowed to go into the actual sanctuary itself. But here they were in the courtyard, and they go up to the door of the sanctuary, or the entrance to the sanctuary, right? And this is kind of, they're presenting it before God. Then they'd lean their hands on it, like lean kind of heavily on it, and like, this is the animal that I'm giving for me, kind of. There was like a process there to that. So in this case, this is going to atone for me, or whatever. Then they would slaughter it somewhere within the courtyard, depending like which direction they'd slaughter it in, and especially because in those days, a lot of the Jewish people, you were living, there was no refrigeration. A lot of people knew how to slaughter animals on their own. So they would slaughter it, and all through this whole process, there had to be an intent that this is going to be used for a sacrifice, and the intent had to stay, or it could actually invalidate. Throughout every step of the process, the intent is this is going to be a sacrifice to atone, to bring closer to God. This is going to be, we're burning this now for this. We're doing this part now for this. All of it had to be with the correct intent, and the mind had to be focused on this. At that point, after the animal was shechted, they would now bring it. The Kohanim, the priest, would now take over, and they would collect some of the blood into this, designated vessel, and they would take the blood and they would dash. They say like dash it. So it's kind of like sprinkle it from the ground onto the base of the altar of the Mizbeach. And what they did is that they would splash from the northwest corner and at the southeast corners. So what that did is, because of the direction that they're coming from, the patterns now made it that it would land on each direction. So that way it was like encircling the whole base of the Mizbeach, right? So it would hit the south and the east side, and it would hit the north and the west side. Now, after that, they would skin the animal, they would cut it up, and they would have to arrange the wood on the fire in the Mizbeach, and then they would burn this particular sacrifice. Everything was burnt up, except for the actual hide, like the skin could go to the Kohen, right? Anything that's kind of, there were different things that the Kohen got to take part of it. This was sort of his payment compensation for doing the service. This is what they did. There's also parts, this had to be washed, or this was cut up in this way, different things. So, but that's the general thing of what occurred. Now, there's also the option to bring a sheep or a goat, and that would be an unblemished male. It can't be old or dirty or sick, of course, any of that. And it went through the whole process again of leaning on it and shechting it and dashing the blood and cutting it up and skinning it, whatever. Now, if the others couldn't be afforded, you can't afford to bring cattle, so you can't bring a bull and you can't bring a sheep or goat. There's an option to bring fowl, and that would be for those who couldn't afford, the more expensive animals, and that would be a turtle dove or a young pigeon, and that could be a male or female that could be brought. It wasn't specific. The unblemished part of it was less specific, but it couldn't be missing a limb. And obviously the whole leaning against its head thing didn't happen with the bird. And the way that it was shechted was different. It was brought to the Kohen, and the Kohanim used to grow their thumbnails, like very long, so that it could actually cut through. Okay, this gets a little gory, but so they could actually cut through the neck with their fingernail. And they would cut through the trachea, the trachea, the esophagus, through the neck bone. And the way that they would press the blood was different. They would kind of take it and sort of somehow press the blood against the mizbeach before they would finish actually severing the head off. They would then remove the digestive organs and kind of discard it, and then everything would kind of there was this whole thing of how they would rip open the body with their hands from behind, but not completely, whatever. They would burn it all up with intention on the mizbeach. So the korban olah, the scent offering, everything was burnt up. Well, besides for the skin, and nothing was kept, but for the bird itself, everything's burnt up. This so has God designated, commanded it should be. Now, you just understand, get a little bit of a picture of what's going on here. You could understand about why they talk about in the Beis HaMikdash, one of the miracles of the Beis HaMikdash is that there were no flies. With these animals being shechted and blood and this, that, whatever, there were no flies in the Beis HaMikdash, and that a pregnant woman never miscarried from the smell of what was going on there. Which, it's pretty remarkable when we think about it. Wasn't only one sacrifice brought a day. There were many, and lots and lots and lots. Okay, now there's an option for what's called a korban mincha, which is, the word mincha sounds familiar, right? This korban mincha was a grain offering. This is the kind of offering that was brought if even fowl, if no kind of animal could be afforded. So you're talking about a very, very poor person. They need to bring an offering, and the animals are just beyond their means. So they have this option for the korban mincha. And there's different ways that could be done with this grain offering. It could be unbaked, it could be baked in loaves, it could be baked in flat cakes, or fried in the shallow pan and fried into deep pan. Well, there are different options of how it was done. But either way, there was this fine wheat flour, and it was 1 log of olive oil, which is about 344 milliliters, 11.6 ounces of olive oil, and 1/10 of an ephah of the fine flour. So that's about 2.5 liters or 2.6 quarts of flour. So if you can imagine. So now there's this whole process about how, let's say they were doing the unbaked, the baked, the unbaked bird, whatever they were doing. So they would mix the dough, they would stir in the oil and the flour until it was mixed. Then they would put this fistful of frankincense on top of it, and you bring it to the Kohen, and the Kohen had this method of, he would take a handful without the frankincense. He had to take a handful only of the flour and the oil by sticking his hand in and using his 3 fingers. You can imagine 3 middle fingers, kind of. So I guess the thumb and the middle 2 fingers, and scooping up a handful. Oh no, the three middle fingers. Sorry, not the thumb. So the 3 middle fingers, scooping up a handful, then using the remaining 2 fingers to kind of brush off any excess. So you take a big handful like that, and that would be designated to be the korban. The rest of it was going to be kept by the Kohanim. Got to eat the rest of it. And then afterwards, all the frankincense was put on top of it. And it was placed on the mizbeach, and they would salt it then, and they would burn it up. And again, there still had to be intention in all of this. This is going to be a korban. We're going to burn this up to be a pleasing offering before God. We're going to burn this up to be an atonement before God. Now and then again, because there's 2.6 quarts of flour, the Kohen didn't grab all of that. They only grabbed a handful, a fistful of it. The rest of it was divided between the Kohanim, and they had to eat it within the area. They could, however they wanted to, they divided it in that area. Now there's an option also to make these if you baked it, so you could have 10 unleavened loaves, and you would bake them, right? So nothing was allowed to be leavened, right? The whole idea of chametz or not chametz, nothing was allowed to be leavened, chametz. There were only 2 very specific times that there was leavened bread that was brought. But as a general idea, all these sacrifices were not leavened. So there's the whole thing also with the 10 flat loaves, the unleavened loaves, and how you made it with the flour and the oil, and the way you would smear the oil, right? The shape of the lambda, kind of like an inverted cuff. So I said it was a V, but it's really kind of like an upside down V. And the way then you broke them in half, and you broke them in half again. Then also the whole procedure the Kohen did. This is also if they were made in the frying pan, the shallow frying pan. So that you can imagine the oil is going to crisp it a lot, right? Because of the shallowness of it. Or there's one where the deep pan, that was a little bit more of an elastic dough. And there's something very specific about this Korban mincha, the grain offering, that God will consider it almost as if it was so precious to him that this man who really cannot afford is still bringing this grain offering, and this is what he can afford. It was almost as if like, wow, you're offering up your very self to me right now. Also because there can be no pride really taken in this offering. When someone's coming with a big, fat, beautiful cow, and like, this is the cow I have designated for sacrifice, and this poor man is coming with a bunch of flour and oil, you can't be like, oh, and I brought flour, right? So really, the place that it's coming from, of this humility and the submission, that makes it even more precious to God. Now, the Torah now tells us that all the sacrifices have to be salted. There must be salt on all sacrifices, which is actually connected to why today our table is like, we call it like an altar, like a mizbeach, and part of the reason why we dip bread into salt is reminiscent of the salt of the sacrifices. Now, with the salt, the sacrifices incorporated all the kingdoms of creation, where you had mineral, plant, animal, and human now, right? Because the human is the person bringing it, they plant an animal according to what it is, and then minerals, the salt. There's also a whole interesting side thing about how salt is created from the heat of the sun's fire, blazing out on the water and drying up the water. So salt is created from water and fire, and water represents kindness, chesed, and fire is gvura, strength. So you have all these elements that play there with the sacrifice. Whatever. The bottom line is everything has to be salted. Now, it also mentioned that there was this grain offering that would be brought from the first of the grains. That was on the second day of Pesach. There was the barley offering, and we call it the Korban, the Omer. Does that sound familiar? The Omer. That was brought on Pesach, and that was like, okay, that was a communal offering for now we can all eat our barley. And then there was a wheat one that was brought on Shavuos. The barley one, they would roast the kernels over the fire, then grind that up into flour. Then you mix the oil and the frankincense. This whole waving thing, and you have to burn it up, and you have to have the right intention, all this sort of stuff. Okay, next sacrifice that was brought is called the shlamim. So they called it the peace sacrifice. This has come for someone who wants to come to praise God. This is something that there was different parts that were shared from the sacrifice. That's part of also why it's called the peace sacrifice, because not all of it was just burned up. But so a cattle, if it was going to be cow that was going to be brought, it could be an unblemished male or female. We went through the whole process: the entrance to the tent, the leaning on it, the slaughtering, the collecting the blood, and you got to dash it against the mizbech, and you have to have the right intention the whole time. Then from this, there were 7 parts that were burned up. It goes through, the fat covering the innards. It's all the fats. The fats covering the innards, the fats of all the innards, or the fats over the small intestines, the 2 kidneys and the fat that covers them, and then the fat on the flanks or something like that, and then the diaphragm with part of the kidney and part of the liver. The diaphragm over the kidneys and part of the liver. Whatever, all that stuff got burned up. That's all for God, and the rest of it is separated. And then if a sheep or a goat was brought, for the sheep, it's all those parts get burned up, and the sheep, it's also the tail beginning from the kidneys is also burned up. Basically, as a general, it says this is going to be a thing for all generations, that all the fattiness belongs to God. Also that there's a thing also about that all the sacrificial fat and blood was always going to be holy, whatever it is. Okay, now we're going to enter these are obligatory. This is one that's going to be an obligatory sacrifice. The next one is called the Chabad Chassidic. That if someone committed a sin, and this is someone, there were different levels of this. So, for example, a Kohen Gadol, a high priest, might be obligated to bring this Korban Chatas, and he did it if he did something that he mistakenly permitted. Right? There was a ruling that was given and he said, oh, this is okay to do, and then it was actually not okay to do. So he had to bring a sacrifice for that, to atone for that. And it's especially important for the Kohen Gadol, because the Kohen Gadol represents atonement. He would go in on Yom Kippur, right, to get atonement for the people. Also, he couldn't do that if he hadn't atoned himself for anything he'd done wrong. In general, this korban in general is also for unintentionally transgressing on the passive/prohibited commandment. And often these are for ones that would be punished with excision, with kares, what's called. So someone unintentionally transgressed it, the person would be liable for it, and would be liable, would have to be punished for it, unless, if it's brought to their attention, they go on to bring, or they realize it, they go on to bring the korban, and this atones for them. So the Kohen Gadol will bring an unblemished young bull, so that's between 1 to 3 years old, and it goes through the process. He brings it to the entrance again, he leans on it in the shecht or whatever, and this time, when he collects the blood, he actually brings it inside. And he would face the paroches, which is the curtain that separated the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies. And then he'd dip his finger in, and he would sprinkle the blood 7 times toward the paroches. And then he would put some of it on the protrusions of the altar that was inside, which is the one where the gold altar where the incense was sacrificed. So they had these 4 protrusions at each corner, and he'd put the blood there, and then he would take it outside and pour the rest of it at the base of the altar that was outside. Then also you have the 7 parts that were mentioned, that all gets burned up. And in this particular korban, the rest of it would actually be brought outside the camp, and there was a designated area of this is where the rest of it gets burned up. So for the Kohen Gadol, everything gets burned up, and that's how it goes. Now, there are times when the Sanhedrin, right, which is the high Jewish court, they might mistakenly rule on something. And the thing, though, is that when they rule on it, that means that people are going to listen to that ruling, and people might transgress now. Unintentionally transgress because the ruling was an incorrect ruling. So in this one, each tribe has to bring one of the young bulls. And they went through the whole process again with the, now when they brought it, the Sanhedrin, each tribe would bring the bull, this is the bull for the tribe, and the Sanhedrin took over from there, leaning the hand and the shafti, whatever, then the Kohen Gadol would take the blood inside and do the whole thing. Now, there's also time, let's say, if a leader, one of the leaders of the Jewish people, if he transgressed in this regard. So he brought up an unblemished male goat, which so up to a year old. He does the leaning and the shafting, whatever, and this time it's not the Kohen Gadol is involved. The regular Kohen would take the blood, you take it up to the Mizbeach, the outer Mizbeach, where the animal sacrifices occurred. With his finger, he'd put the blood on it, put blood on the protrusions, then pour the rest at the base of the altar, and then they would burn up all the fats, and whatever didn't have to be burned up, the rest of it was eaten by the Kohanim. The priest would eat the rest of the meat of that sacrifice. Now, if an individual transgress, someone, in their personal life, they could bring a goat or a sheep, and then this could be an unblemished female goat or sheep, actually, that they brought, and then the whole process, as with the leader, occurred. Now, there were sin offerings, the Korban Chatas, that went according to the means. So, that went not according to means. Yeah, they went according to means, but also these are for slightly different reasons. So, for example, if someone was summoned to testify as a witness under oath to say, this is what Curry said, I swear I wasn't there, I swear I didn't see anything. Right? It's like they get called out for that. Or if someone touches the carcass of an impure animal, so it could be a kosher animal that was improperly shechted, or a carcass of an animal that's not kosher at all, and then eats from consecrated food of the Mishkan, like enters into the tabernacle, I forgot, and then he enters and whatever. That's something that's actually forbidden. You have to be pure when you go in. Or if someone touched a person who's defiled, for whatever reason, that person is not pure right now. So it used to be back in the day, the sensitivity of holiness was so much that this holiness transfer occurred enough that the awareness of and the strictness of what it was then. So if they accidentally then went in, or if they intentionally went in, but because they had forgotten, this is something they have to atone for. Or if someone made an oath to do good or not good, I'm going to fast, or I'm going to, whatever good thing that's going to happen, and then he forgets and then violates the oath. So these are all reasons also to have to bring this korban chatas. Now, so he confesses his sin, he's going to be a korban, it could be a female sheep, or a female goat, or if someone can't afford that, they could bring the fowl, like the 2 turtle doves, or 2 pigeons. And here it's 2 because one sort of served as a chatas for pardon, like, oh, forgive me for what I've done, and one served as a korban ola to let's rebuild this relationship. Let's reinstate, let me be reinstated in God's favor. And if neither of these could be afforded, then they could do the 10th and 8th of flour. They could do the grain thing. Now this one specifically, because it's a sin offering, it didn't get to be quote unquote like glorified the way the other ones were. So there's no oil or frankincense in this. But after this flour, they did the whole removal thing, and it was burned up, and then everything else was the Kohanim would have to share what was left. Okay, now the Parsha finishes off with one more offering, and that is the guilt offering. This is if a person unintentionally made personal use of something that should have been burned up for a sacrifice. Whatever, or they didn't realize, this meat was designated was sacrificial, right? And you thought it was permitted, something like that. Because you imagine there's a lot going on in the courtyard with all the people coming. So if something like that happened and they realize it, they bring this guilt offering. Now, these are only specific examples that's being brought for each of these offerings here specifically, but a lot of these offerings, they're going to come up again. We're going to see more of these, but here we're getting the basic breakdown of them. So there, in this regard, for this guilt offering, they bring an unblemished ram. If it's a Kohen, he brings an unblemished ram, so it's about 13 months to 2 years old, and it's got to be worth at least two silver shekel. So it's got to be, this is the worth that we're talking about. There's also has to be a monetary value and a fine that's paid on it, and the fine becomes a fifth payment, and it has to be 25% of the value of whatever was used had to be paid. Now, if a person is uncertain if they transgressed a prohibitive commandment, then they can bring a ram up as a sacrifice, and they bring it to the Kohen. It would also have to be brought up. A person had to bring a guilt offering if they deny a claim that someone else made to them. So, example, they said, "Oh, I left this article by them, like a deposit or a loan." They said, "Oh, I never got this," Or if you withheld money for wages, or if an object was robbed from him and he said, "Oh, this person took it," right? Or if he gave money for a loan or for whatever, he said, "Oh, he never gave me the money." So someone who, or he denies finding a lost article, like, "Oh, you picked up my thing." "Oh, no, I didn't. I never found it," right? Or if he swears false against any of the above. So these 5 situations, if someone denies what someone else claims and he swears against it, and then it's like, "Oh wait, I messed up. I got to atone for it." So he's got to return whatever whatever was taken, or he's got to pay up whatever was withheld. And then there's also the fine that's tacked on, the 25%, and then he brings a ram as an offering. So that actually gets us all the way through Vayikra. That gets us through a lot of the offerings, the sacrifices that were brought, and kind of what was going on there with them.